Stress is a funny thing. It can be more exhausting than actual physical labor. When you lay down at night with stress eating away at you, sleep is indeed the last thing on your mind. So when Stephanie awoke from one of the longest nights of her life, she couldn't tell the difference between her nightmares and her own horrifying thoughts. But today is a new day and she was ready to take it head on. Though just a cadet now, it wouldn't be long before she was a full-blown LAPD officer. And from there, she would continue to learn and train and try to be the best she possibly could. And it wasn't too long before Stephanie was considered one of the best rookies on the job. And as time went by, she was no longer a rookie, but she was still one of the best. She began to follow her drive for self-improvement and followed her dreams of becoming a detective. A year later, she started her own private investigation firm. She still pushed herself on a personal level to become better and better. A year after that, she entered the world's police and fire games, and there she would win medal after medal, including the gold. So many eyes were on her as she climbed the ladder in her career. Do you remember the DARE program, Drug Abuse Resistance Education? You know, the whole dare to keep kids off of drugs? Well, guess who was in charge of that? Yep, Stephanie. A few years after running that program, she moved up to internal affairs, where she continued to work hard and excel. And just when things were going so good for her, they got even better. A few years later, she met and married a fellow officer. A couple of years into their marriage, they wanted to start a family, so they adopted a little girl. And at this point in her life is when Stephanie finally started to feel like things were falling into place. With the love of her husband and her adorable little girl, things were good. Years later, she became the head instructor at the police academy, where she continued to move up in ranks, where she finally became the head of the Fine Arts and Forgery Division. But let's talk about today. After all, everything I've said up to this point is good. And you know there has to be some sort of tragedy for me to be telling you this story. So today, as Stephanie headed to work with errands trailing through her mind, she was running a little late, which she never did, and in fact, this was her first late day in years since being with the art division. Her and her husband were going on a small vacation to see his parents tomorrow, so she'd have to find time to clean her car before she left. She'd also have to pick up her dog from the vet on the way home. And as for dinner, they were just going to have to order in because there's no way she'd have time to prepare anything. But this was fine because her daughter loved pizza. She sat at her desk and for a moment was a little overwhelmed at all the papers that had piled up during the week. Not to mention some papers that should be on her desk but were not. She was expecting a case report to be handed over well before Wednesday, and here it is Friday and still no report. So she's going to have to complain and be that person. But on the bright side, it is Friday, so at least there's the weekend to look forward to. It will be nice to get away for a few days. But that's when it happened. That's when everything changed. Two young officers walked up to Stephanie as she sat there sorting through the piles of paperwork. It seemed they needed her assistance to question someone about some stolen art. He was waiting in the interrogation room. But when she got there was no one there but her and the officers who walked her there. "Hey, Stephanie, do you know someone by the name of John Rutten?" they asked. A cold chill shot up her spine at lightning speed, and for a moment, it was as if she had forgotten how to articulate words before stuttering out the answer, "Yes." After that, the next question came. "Do you know what happened to his wife?" "Yes, she was killed, I think." Then the next question came, and the next, and the next. And just like that, Stephanie was transported back to that night almost 3 decades ago. That night of horrible sleep and unrelenting stress. The night she laid down after the worst day imaginable. The day she took someone's life. The day Stephanie had become a monster. She was in love with a man, or maybe it was more than love. It was closer to an obsession. But she couldn't help it. She loved him so very desperately. And they had a good thing, that is until she came along. Her name was Sherry, and she ruined everything. John would have never fallen for her if she didn't insert herself into their lives. Stephanie thought she would never get over him. She thought the hurt she felt would never go away, nor could it get any worse. But when she found out they were getting married, it did. Between her rage and sheer pain, it was the only two things she was capable of feeling anymore. And those two feelings never went away. They just took turns consuming her life. So it was a fateful day that Stephanie made the decision to pay Sherry a visit. To cuss her out, or maybe to beg her to leave John, or to tell her what she did was wrong. She didn't know what she was going to say, but she knew she had to say something. But when Sherry opened that door, Stephanie just saw red. What started off as a shouting match soon turned violent. Pushing and shoving, then hitting. All the anger, all the rage, all the heartbreak and tears, they all poured out of Stephanie in a river of blind hate. And what started off as seeing red ended with seeing Sherry's lifeless body laying on the floor. And then the gears instantly started turning, hiding evidence, erasing clues, misleading her fellow officers. And for the rest of her life, she would spend her hours making up for what she had done. That wasn't her. It wasn't who she was. She was a good person, and she would spend the rest of her life proving it. And that's just what she did. In time, she buried this tragic, gut-wrenching deed deep, deep down inside. She didn't murder anyone. She could never do anything like that. How could she? She was an officer, and a good one at that, one of LA's finest. She had hoped every bad guy she would take off the street would be one step closer to redemption. And in time, she had forgotten the events that unfolded so very, very long ago. But here they were now, and no amount of good deeds would ever change that. Forgetting her past would not undo it, and pretending it never happened would not erase it. The questions just kept coming, and her answers just kept continuing to skirt around them. She kept rambling and talking on, trying to hold on to the life she had up to this very moment that was so quickly melting away. Inside, she was panicked and horrified and desperately wanting to just break down and scream. But that's not me anymore. I'm not that kid anymore. But in order to do that, she had to let go of her relentless denial and be honest. And she just simply couldn't. They had her. Almost 30 years later, they had her. They had her DNA and a pile of evidence all pointing directly at her. It was a reality she just couldn't face. She ended the interview and tried to walk out, but they were waiting. Right outside that door, they were all waiting. They brought her right back into the room, but this time wearing a pair of handcuffs. As they read her rights, it was all she could do but think of that list of hers. Her sweet dog that sat waiting at the vet, waiting for Mama to come save her. She would never see or pet him again. That trip that she was going to go on, never going to happen. Her messy car, she would never drive it again. The paperwork that she needed by Wednesday, well, that didn't seem so important all of a sudden either. The magnitude of her new reality just kept growing. Never walking into her own home again, cooking for her family, sharing a pizza with her daughter, birthdays, Christmases, anniversaries, sitting around with friends having a drink and talking about the stresses of the job and sharing some laughs. Stephanie's life, as she knew it from this point on, was over. And for some guy who she hasn't even thought about in over 20 years. She sat in that chair still wearing her uniform, but she was no longer a cop. She was no longer one of the good guys. Her well-kept secret was now out, and she had to face the consequences for her actions of some stupid, hot-headed little girl who no longer existed. Wearing cuffs and embarrassed, she was escorted from this room to another, until finally she sat alone in the small cell, and then a larger one. And from there, she would sit a year waiting for her trial. Stephanie had become everything she spent her entire life fighting against. Stephanie was sentenced 27 years to life at the California Institute for Women in Corona.